Hello and welcome to our course Marketing Management Part 1. We are in week 5 and discussing about our 4th module, that is buyer behavior. So, as you can recall from previous sessions, we have discussed till now what consumer behavior is, what this process of buying behavior includes. It includes 5 steps: need recognition, information gathering, evaluation of alternatives, purchase and post purchase. So, we have discussed about till now the need recognition or need realization, or you can also call as problem situation that we want the problem that we want to solve as a consumer. Then the next stage is that information search, where we discussed about the concept of consumer involvement. Therein we have seen that there are 2 types of consumer involvement, high involvement and low involvement, and we have also looked into the evolving new forms of information sources like intermediary. So, after that we have started discussing into the different factors that affects this complex buying behavior, the 5-stage process. So, we looked into the different factors that can influence this process is that socio-cultural influence. We have discussed in detail about culture and subculture, how important the role of culture is in the consumption behavior of the individuals from a particular culture. Then we have looked into the social factors, socio-economic classes, roles and status, how they shape up the individual consumers consumption behavior. And then we have looked into some of the personal factors like age, lifestyle, personality, how they actually affect the consumer behavior. So, today I am going to talk about psychological influences, and as you can see on the slide, broadly I am going to talk about 4 different things that actually influence the consumer behavior. So, I am going to talk about motivation first, which will be followed by perception, learning and memory. Now, coming on to the first one, which is motivation. Motivation can be defined as the energizing force that initiates, guides and maintains goal oriented behavior. So, this is basically the force behind you to act. If you have a need, the motivation is something, the force that will enable you to act to fulfill your need. There are couple of important theories in the context of the motivation. The first theory, the Freudian theory of motivation, which talks about the 3 level of an individual consumer, that the basic thing behind the basic argument behind this theory is that behavior is guided by the subconscious or unconscious motivations. So, it talks about the 3 level of process, or what you say, the basically the information processing, that something which is visible, that is super ego. Then you have in between, which is subconscious, which is ego, and then your something which is not known to even yourself is the unconsciousness, that is instinctive drive. So, lot of our needs are basically a lot of our consumption are basically driven by this instinctive drives. Sometimes we do not know exactly what are the exact reason we are consuming. So, we might be thinking about some overt thing that we are consuming because of this particular attribute, but behind that attribute we have something at the unconscious level that is driving us to have the consumption of a particular offering. So, if you take like we look for attribute like mileage, or probably instead of, if we are given a choice between a cycle or a 2-wheeler or 4-wheeler to drive inside basically a green campus, and if a person chooses to be cycle, it is not that he cannot afford basically the 2-wheeler or 4-wheeler, or he is not willing to pay basically for the fuel price. The thing is that at the subconscious level he might be very concerned or at unconscious level he might be concerned about about the environmental degradation, and that instinctive drive basically take him towards purchasing the basically bicycle instead of two wheeler or four wheeler, or probably something which is environmentally friendly. The next theory is like on motivation is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as it is shown in the slide, you can see that it itself talks about the hierarchy of needs. It says like needs are basically in a hierarchical order. So, there are some basic needs and then there are basically some higher level of needs. At the very basic level of needs, we have physiological needs like food and basically hunger or probably thirst. All those things are physiological needs, they are the very basic level of needs. Then we have needs which are related with the safety and the security. So, security of our family, security of ourselves, those are basically the safety level needs. Then we have belonging needs like love, affection, and those kind of needs comes under this belonging thing. Then we have the fourth level, which is the esteem, that is self respect or the recognition, and that comes inside the self this esteem. And the highest level of need in the Maslow's hierarchy of need is self actualization, which is like you are basically able to realize your full potential, full inner potential, and that is basically the self actualization needs. So, the argument behind this theory is that when a consumer is able to fulfill his basic level need, physiological safety needs, then he basically moves to the upper level of needs, that is belonging or esteem or self actualization. However, in the real life you may find that one of the criticism of this theory is that the consumer may not exactly go in this order of needs, that until and unless basically safety need or physiological needs is not fulfilled, they will not look for basically the love or self esteem. For some people, self esteem might be more important than having a basic necessities even being fulfilled. So, that is what the basic criticism of this theory is. We have a third type of theory, which is Hirschberg's motivation or hygiene theory. According to this theory, there are two types of motivating factors. One is motivators and the second one is hygiene factors. Motivators are the hygiene factors are the factors which are the basic minimum that a consumer expect. Absence of this hygiene factor will leads to dissatisfaction. However, the presence of this hygiene factor will not necessarily lead you to the satisfaction or probably the customer delight. On the other side, you have to have besides hygiene factor motivators to basically create customer satisfaction or customer delights. So, for an example, if you take basically case of a restaurant. So, when you go there and if you do not find cleanliness or probably the someone who comes and takes your order. So, these are basically sort of hygiene factors. On the other side, the motivating factors, motivators could be the kind of menu being offered or basically the preparation of the food that they prepare, it is so tasty, those will be the motivators. But however, if you find whatever might be the motivating factor, if their basic things like cleanliness is not there in a restaurant, you might not prefer to go there. For an example, instead of taking restaurant, you can take another example as an assignment, and when you go back you can think about many of you must be having two wheelers or four wheelers and you might be using it, I mean you might be going to some petrol pump or for the diesel, whatever is basically the input in your vehicle. So, you might be going to the retail outlet where you might get petrol or diesel. So, think about that retail outlet and think about what are the basically the motivators or and hygiene factors in that context, in the context of the petrol pump or the retail outlet which provides the diesel for you, and try to understand presence of something, what factors or what services work as a hygiene factors and what basically works as a motivators for you. after basically this motivation theory, the next thing that is said to influence basically consumer behaviors is perception. Uh, Perception, as can be understood, it is the process by which an individual selects, organizes and interprets information to create a meaningful picture of the world. So, basically based on the information that you select, organize and interpret, you create a meaning out of that information about the objects in the world, and that leads to you for the formation of perception in your mind. Perception is said to be more important than the reality in the case of marketing, because what matters to marketeers is more about perception than reality. So, your car might be technically very good, but if it is not perceived as a basically a very technically good product or a technologically inferior product, then probably consumers will not prefer you, at least on that aspect, and that will be a probably something deterrence to the purchase for consumers in that case. Understand that perception is something very important for marketers to manage, and in this context of the perception, you have to understand there are three things: selective attention, selective retention and selective distortion, that leads to two individuals to perceive the same object in different ways, and this differing perception will ultimately can ultimately leads to a different kind of outcome or attitude or behavior towards that object. So, the first one, selective attention, is that that individual might notice only a certain type of stimuli which are being sent towards that consumer. So, because since we come across so many advertisements, so many basically promotional campaigns from the marketeer side, we tend to basically filter out some of those or many of those or most of, in fact most of those stimuli from the marketeer side, and you will find out that previous researchers says that it is most likely or it is more likely that we are going to observe or we are going to give attention to certain kind of stimuli which are related with our current needs. So, if you are looking for a laptop, so it is quite possible that whenever you are watching a television, you might notice the laptop related ad, or if you are looking for a mobile phone, you will look more for a you will notice a mobile phone ad probably more attentively than probably noticing a ad which is related with any other electronic items. Then also, like the other thing is about selective attention is that we tend to notice something which we anticipate. So, if you are going to a store to purchase something, then probably when you go there, then that product category you are more likely to notice, you will notice more of the brands in that product category rather than probably looking at the brands in the other product category. So, take the case of this laptop. Here you will see that when if you visit any store, then because of your orientation you will see probably more and more offerings from on the laptop side. You will see more of the brands on the laptop side. On the same side, you may just ignore some of the brands or the offering in the case of desktop or probably other form of the computing. So, that is what this selective attention is. Then you have selective retention, which is about you may basically attend certain stimuli, or marketeers may be able to get the attention of the customers. However, the customer will not process or understand the information the way it has been sent to them. So, that is what selective distortion is. In this case of the selective distortion, you will see that in the case of selective distortion, you will see that consumers will tend to modify the message according to their existing product or services belief, so that there is no basically mismatch between the existing belief of the consumers. Then the third thing is the selective retention, that we tend to basically retain only some certain things about the products which probably we like, or probably we prefer to retain, or probably we prefer to understand, and then some of the things which we will not prefer, we will not. So, it is like this is something which favors the strong brands, or your existing brand that you are consuming in is like that you will tend to basically remember only the good attributes of a brand and that you consume, and you tend to remember only the negative attributes or negative things about the competing brands. So, that is a sort of selective retention thing. Along with this selective attention, selective distortion and selective retention of information is that subliminal perception, which is about the message which is being conveyed also has some kind of background cues. Sometimes we tend to basically see or we try to purchase something because of this the cues which are embedded into that message. So, you will see that an ad by armed forces where they talk about basically the being the training and being the basically the life, and at the same time they also show that the family benefits and the other benefits which are being provided for being a armed force personnel, and those are some of the message which are basically subliminal perception or embedded cues which are directed towards the consumers. Then the third thing which is important in the case of psychological influences on the consumer is a change is learning. So, learning is basically a change in behavior occurring as a result of past experience. Learning is an extremely important concept because it basically helps a consumer to behave and modify its behavior toward product and the services. There are different theories in the case of services which we will talk about. Service is basically a result of interplay. This learning is basically the result of interplay between drive, stimuli, cues, responses and reinforcement. So, drive is a basically strong internal stimulus impelling action. Cues are minor stimuli that determine when, where and how a person responds. A marketeer's job is in creating the demand for a product is to create strong drives, internal drives, so that consumer is directed towards a product. Then he should create the basically the cues, minor cues or motivating cues, sort of rewards, that if he consumes something he is being rewarded for that, and then he should be in this his consumption should be reinforced. So, there are two types of theories on the learning side, behaviorist and cognitive theory. In the behaviorist theory you have classical conditioning and then you have instrumental conditioning. In the classical conditioning you will see that an individual, when he sees an unconditional stimulus, there is an unconditioned response to corresponding to that. Now, when we attach this unconditioned stimulus with some conditioned stimulus, you will find out that consumers learn to behave towards this conditioned stimulus in a similar way they basically behave towards unconditioned stimulus. Like take the example like this ad of Bank of Baroda, where they have brought in Rahul Dravid as a brand ambassador. Now, what they are trying to do, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you see Rahul Dravid? So, the first thing that comes to your mind is being dependable, being trustworthy, and here in this case this celebrity figure is a basically unconditioned response. So, this Rahul Dravid is a basically unconditioned response, and towards that the response being response being generated is that trust and being a dependable person. Then when you attach this this celebrity along with the brand, so this Bank of Baroda is a basically conditioned stimulus, and you see that the conditioned response towards that consumers will learn over the period of time is that they will start perceiving, I mean that is what is expected from the company side, is that the perception about they will learn that the brand, this Bank of Baroda, is also is basically having similar traits as this celebrity. Then you have instrumental conditioning, the other theory which talks about that that our behavior towards our behavior when we get basically is shaped by basically the kind of reward or the punishment that we get. So, once we behave, it depends whether we get a reward or punishment, increases or decreases the probability of our response. So, whether we are going to repurchase something back, it depends on whether we had a rewarding experience last time, or probably we did not like, or we were punished to consume certain offering. So, that will basically take you to this increase or decrease in probability of response. The third theory basically this learning theories was the cognitive theory, and this cognitive learning is more of a knowledge based decision making, that as a consumers you understand your goal, and then that determines your objective behavior. You look for the information and you basically try to achieve your goal. So, cognitive theory is more based on the the information, and the affective part is the feeling part is not present in this this decision making process. So, I will end this session here. We will meet into the next session. We will discuss more into this consumer decision making process and the evaluation of the alternatives. Thank you.